Hey there, human geography students. This lecture is to introduce us to the basics of the geography of language. I have here a great quote by the American Noah Webster, like the Webster that made Webster's dictionary, about how he views language. He writes, "Language is not an abstract construction of the learned or of dictionary makers, but it is something arising out of the work, needs, ties, joys, affections, tastes, of long generations of humanity, and has its bases broad and low, close to the ground." That's an excellent perspective that reminds us that language is born of the people and their daily needs, fears, loves, and is something that stretches into the darkness of the past, a thing given to us by our ancestors. This is perfect for us because we're concerned with both the geography of language and the idea of language as a principal component of culture. Remember that language is one of the things that we would consider a metafact, one of the intangible components of culture, like religion. Language, and religion for that matter, seem like these ancient, unchanging things, but the reality is that they're constantly changing and adapting. For example, the new artifacts and sociofacts that are created with each passing year or generation leads to the creation of new words. We can see that in terms like dark web and deep fake, words added to Webster's dictionary in 2019. Another example added in 2019 is fidna. Like I'm fitting to teach you about language. Let's get started. Languages are universal to culture. There is no group of people in the modern or historical world that does not have a spoken language. Language is most often thought of as the spoken word alone, but language also includes the written word. Linguists talk about whether or not a language has a literary tradition, or in other words, a tradition writing their words. Not all languages have a written component. In general, this lack of a literary tradition increases the risk of language extinction, with the language dying with the death of its last speaker. Languages with literary traditions can be reborn, even if the people that originally spoke them haven't been around for centuries. The lack of a literary tradition also makes it more difficult, if not impossible, for linguists to trace the transformation of a language over time. Language is lastly a fundamental component of the human experience and culture. It is the foundation for many of our social interactions and the way we express our most complex emotions and ideas. It is absolutely fundamental to our identity and even our membership within a culture group. Languages can also reveal a lot about the way people and cultures view reality and the world around them. For example, some African languages have no word or term for the concept of a god. Some Southeast Asian languages have no tenses, reflecting a less sharp cultural importance placed on the then and now. Language serves as a culture complex for groups of people. For example, Arabic has 80 words related to camel. Japanese contains something like 20 words for various types of rice. Russian is rich in terms for ice and snow. Native Hawaiian has reportedly 108 words for sweet potato, 65 for fishing nets, and 47 words for banana. In the mountainous regions of Spain, Spanish has developed a number of words to describe the features of mountains or hills, like you can see here from one of our textbooks. In different groups, like the Caribs of the Caribbean and the Zulus of Southern Africa, there are words that only men or only women are allowed to say. And so, within our languages, we get great insight into the particulars of our culture. Currently, linguists, the people who study language, believe that humans first started communicating through spoken sounds as recently as tens of thousands of years ago, to as long as hundreds of thousands of years ago. There isn't strong consensus there, but something in the range of 50,000 to 100,000 years ago is a safe guess. Although again, it's very possible language stretches even farther back than that. Linguists are not entirely sure how language diffused either. Was it through relocation diffusion? as the original language speakers migrated out of one region and brought their words with them to spread to other groups of primitive humans that lacked languages, either peacefully or through conquest? Or was it through some kind of contagious diffusion based on interactions where the people mostly stayed in place, but the language diffused from one group to another through frequent encounters? Our textbook mentions the work of Quentin Atkinson, a biologist from New Zealand who examines the amount of phonemes or sounds that are made in a particular language, how many different noises or distinct sounds that are used in making the words of that language. Atkinson argues that languages in West Africa are the languages with the most diversity and complexity of sounds, implying that they have been around the longest and transformed the most. According to Atkinson, the farther you travel from West Africa, the less diverse are the sounds used in languages. This is only one theory, though, among many, and again, there's no consensus among linguists on the origins of language. It's still interesting to think about. Standard and official languages are terms used by linguists to refer to forms and usage of a particular language. And while they sound similar, they have distinct meanings that we should know. Starting with standard language. Our definition for standard language is a language substantially uniform, or the same, with respect to spelling, grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary, and representing the approved community norm of the tongue or language. But standard language can be a little bit more complicated in real life because the reality is not everyone in a country speaks the language the same way. For example, standard French is based on the dialect of the Paris region, but not everybody in France sounds like the people around Paris. In Britain, the standard language is referred to as received pronunciation, the example from our textbook, and is more of an accent really than a dialect, and reflects the speech patterns of the social elite of the 19th century, an elite that maybe only accounts for 3 to 5% of British people. In Spain, Castilian Spanish became the standard in 1492, with the Castile-led reconquista of Spain from the Islamic Moors. Modern Standard Chinese is based on the Mandarin dialect of Beijing. The classical or literary Arabic is the form of Arabic used in the Quran and became the established norm, although again, this may not reflect how Arabic is spoken by most people in everyday life across the Arabic-speaking world. So, how is the standard language different from official language? The standard language, remember, is going to be sort of the language that the version of the language you might teach in a Spanish class or in an Arabic language class or in an English language class. The official language is going to be a little bit different. Its definition reads, a governmentally designated language of instruction, of government, of the courts, and other official public and private communication. So standard language is going to be the language of day-to-day life, while official language is often the language of the government, such as for paperwork, closed captioning, government websites, etc. So for example, Zimbabwe, which is home to several large ethnic groups, has the most official languages in the world, at 16, including English and sign language. South Africa, which has had a very complex colonial and post-colonial history, has a constitution that mandates 11 official languages. We can expand our study of this topic and change the scale from the national level to the supranational level of multi-state organizations like the European Union or the United Nations. For example, the European Union recognizes 24 official languages, while having 3 languages that most work is done in. And the United Nations, an organization that includes almost every country in the world, has 6 official languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. The United States, as a country, does not have an official language, largely due to the immigrant history of the U.S., while also acknowledging the fact that between 10 to 15% of Americans today speak a language other than English entirely. Even still, 31 U.S. states have declared English as the official language of their state. Which brings us to language classification. All right, this is an essential piece of knowledge for this unit. You need to know these terms and their order. And I would suggest adding examples of each level for different languages like the one you see here for English as you learn more about this. So, English is the language. It is from the West Germanic language group, which itself is part of the Germanic language branch, which is a branch of the Indo-European language family. This is how languages are classified by linguists according to their relationship to other languages. Sometimes this will be referred to as a language taxonomy. A friend of mine teaches his students to think of these terms in the shape of an hourglass. The language family is the biggest and includes the most languages. For example, the Indo-European language family includes somewhere between 400 and 500 languages. Then the branch will have fewer languages within it. A language group will have even less, until you get to a single language, like English. That's the skinny point of the hourglass. But within English, you have multiple dialects, subdialects, and accents, which would give you a broader shape on the bottom. So something that looks like an hourglass is a good visual for thinking about language taxonomy or classification. All right, let's break this down and take a closer look at each layer of this language taxonomy. Languages are organized by linguists first into language families, giant constructs of related languages, with some of the largest language families, like Indo-European, containing hundreds of languages, although some language families, like Japanese, contain just one. At one point, the language family was probably a single language that changed as its speakers migrated and the language diffused, mixing with and borrowing from other neighboring languages along the way, with geographical and social isolation of one group from another, leading to the development of different words and pronunciations and grammar. This process of diffusion, and then a combination of both isolation from and interactions with other languages, has led to the creation of today's many languages. But how many are there exactly? Good question, but it depends on what we count as a distinct language. Do we include all languages that are thought to have ever existed, even the ones we can't translate or pronounce and that have no living speakers? Do we include newly created languages, such as Esperanto, created to be a global language? Do we include fictional languages, like Tolkien's Elvish or Star Trek's Klingon, both of which have complete rules for grammar and entire dictionaries dedicated to them? Or what about dialects? Are people in Mexico and people in Spain speaking the same exact language, or should we count that as two distinct languages? As you can see, this is not so simple of a question to answer. After all, a safe number, though, would be around 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. With that in mind, there are probably close to around 140 language families to which most of those 7,000 languages could be grouped into based on similarities in vocabulary, phonology, such as sounds and pronunciation, and grammar. However, just 15 language families account for well over 90% of all of those 7,000 languages. In fact, just 8 language families account for close to 90% of all the languages spoken in the world today. Here are examples of the 8 largest language families in terms of speakers. You should familiarize yourself with this list and hopefully have looked at something similar in your reading guide and textbook. We can see that Indo-European, which includes languages like English, Russian, Farsi, Hindi, is at the top of the list with about 3 billion speakers within that language family, which is now a worldwide language family, but was originally spoken in Europe and Asia. Sino-Tibetan, which includes languages like Chinese and Tibetan, accounts for about 1.5 billion speakers, and is mostly found, though, today in China and the surrounding areas. The Afro-Asiatic family, sometimes called Hamitic Semitic, include languages like Arabic and Hebrew, has about 500 million speakers, mostly in North Africa and Southwest Asia. The Austronesian language family, also sometimes called the Malayo-Polynesian family, which includes Hawaiian languages, but also Malagasy, right? Languages spoken in the Pacific all the way over to Madagascar off the coast of Africa. This includes more than 250 million speakers, so something like 250 million people speaking Austronesian languages. Dravidian, which includes languages like Tamil and Malayalam, accounts for also close to about 250 million language speakers and can be found in southern India and places like the island of Sri Lanka, also south of India. Niger-Congo language family includes languages like Swahili and Yoruba, and includes something like 200 million language speakers spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The Altaic language family includes languages like Turkish or Mongol, and also includes about 200 million speakers and can be found from Turkey to Mongolia in sort of northeastern China. And then Japanese, which includes Japanese, and accounts for about 125 million speakers, almost all of them found in Japan. The distribution of languages within a language family often reflects human migrations. This map shows some of the distribution of the major branches of the Indo-European family, which can be explained by ancient migrations of people, sometimes many thousands of years in the past. There are competing theories explored in your textbook about how exactly the Indo-European language family initially spread as it did, such as the Anatolian farmer theory or the Kurgan theory. However the language initially spread, more recent migrations can explain much of its current distribution. For example, the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European, in the blue here, which stretches from Turkey to India, is related to the same group of migratory people that are thought to have brought the core of the religion of Hinduism to India, maybe as far back as 1700 BC. The distribution of the branch of Latin or Romance languages, shown in green, relates to the spread of the Roman Empire and the language of Latin. And we can see in the gray the spread of the Balto-Slavic language branch into Eastern Russia and Central Asia through more recent migration and conquest of the Russian Empire. Notice also the placement of non-Indo-European languages. Look at Hungary, for example, in Eastern Europe. The languages spoken in Hungary are from the Uralic language family and was probably brought to Eastern Europe by the invasions, a kind of relocation diffusion, of people like the Huns that invaded the Roman Empire, or a later group known as the Magyars from a similar cultural and linguistic background. Lastly, notice the region in Western Europe between Spain and France. This is where the Basque language is spoken. Basque is considered an isolated language, which means it doesn't seem to be related to any other languages around it, or any language families at all for that matter. Some linguists have proposed that Basque is related to whatever language family was used in Europe before the introduction of Indo-European several thousand years ago. Zooming out in scale to examine the whole world, we can see that the Indo-European language family, shown here in the beige color, have spread over much of the world. Again, this is almost entirely explained by migration or relocation diffusion. In many cases, these migrations were invasions by foreign militaries at first, like the conquistadors in Mexico or the British in India, followed often by extensive colonization of settlers, like in North America, India, and Australia by the British Empire, Central and South America by the Spanish Empire, and across Northern Asia by the Russian Empire. The legacy of colonialism and imperialism has left many lasting marks in the modern world. The distribution of languages due to those relocations and migrations of people and culture that followed imperial conquests is one of them. Colonialism and the building of empire in the distant past and in the not distant past can explain much of the distribution of today's languages of today's most widely spoken languages, not just Indo-European languages, but the caliphates of the old Arab empires or Islamic empires can explain some of the distribution of Arabic, as well as the growth of the ancient growth, of the old Persian Empire, shows the spread of that language. But other things too, like trade and religious diffusion, are also involved in the spread of languages from their hearth, such as the spread of Chinese, or also Arabic for that matter, as well as English and French, or any of the languages we might see on this list, an idea we'll talk about in other lectures as we explore lingua francas and trade languages. After language families, many of our textbooks and the course articulation for AP Human Geography differ about the classification system. Our textbook identifies branches and groups. A language branch is defined as a collection of languages related through a common ancestor several thousand years ago. Differences are not as extensive or as old as with language families. Within Indo-European, there are commonly identified 8 branches. These are Germanic, Romance, or Latin or Italic, Balto-Slavic, or sometimes just Slavic, Indo-Iranian, which are occasionally subdivided into separate branches as well, Armenian, Albanian, Celtic, and Greek, which is sometimes referred to as Hellenic. Other textbooks, though, identify this second layer of classification as subfamilies, and even a third one calls them genetic nodes. We're going to stick with language branches, though, and that's for the most part what you should see on a human geography test as well. Below language branches, or sort of sprouting off from a language branch, is a language group, which is defined as a collection of languages within a branch that share a common origin in the relatively recent past and display relatively few differences in grammar and vocabulary, relatively few when compared to language branches or language families and the differences between them. So some examples would be English, which is in a language in the West Germanic group, which, along with Northern Germanic, are a part of the Germanic language branch, which, together with the other language branches, are a part of the Indo-European language family. So language families can be broken down into branches, which can be further broken down into groups, and usually the distinction has to do with the effects of isolation and interaction with other languages over a long period of time that help to make one language more and more distinct until it becomes unidentifiable as the same language, right? And has become a distinct language in its own right. We can classify languages still further by talking about dialect and accent. Variations in vocabulary and the meanings of words, spelling, and pronunciation are what defines dialects. It can also include differences in syntax, or the way words are put together, the sort of order in which you arrange your words, cadence, or the rhythm of speech, and even the speed or the pace of speech. These variations are significant enough that most speakers can notice them, but small enough that speakers can mutually comprehend one another. So, for example, English is spoken in both Scotland and Britain and in the United States, but identifiably different in all those places based on the choice of words used in each spot. Likewise, the language spoken in the dialect, of English spoken in the southern part of the United States is distinct from the dialect of English, the words used, the way things are pronounced, the grammar and structure of your sentences, distinct from the form of English spoken in the American Northeast, right? That would be an example of dialects. Accent is basically just pronunciation, which is important because even if the written form of a statement follows the standard language, an accent by a speaker can reveal the regional home of a person who reads that statement out loud. And then an isogloss is defined as a boundary that separates regions in which different language uses predominate. Sometimes vocabulary, but more often or not, an isogloss is going to distinguish one dialect region from another. All right? We will see some examples of that here in a moment. This would be one way that we can look at an isogloss, right? The word up top can be pronounced a couple different ways. Think about how you pronounce it and where you would find yourself, on what side of the isogloss boundary you might find yourself. So I say caramel, all right? Some people pronounce this word caramel. Some regions, although very few, use the two interchangeably, right? The distinction, and you can see that this is kind of like a, southern United States and maybe East Coast kind of part of the country that says the word caramel, and kind of the west and northern parts of the country say the word caramel, right? That line that you can draw, that boundary between word usage, is what we call an isogloss. It is. How would you describe or how would you pronounce the word at the top of this slide? Again, I say Bowie knife, but some people pronounce this as Bowie knife, like in Texas and in parts of the East Coast. Another example, I say crayon. Some people say crayon or something, something that sounds a little bit more like you're saying like crayon or something like that, depending on where you are. And the lines that you would draw to distinguish where one word usage or pronunciation or dialect predominates and where another dominates is an isogloss. There it is. Is this word lawyer or lawyer? Well, depends on where you are, right? And the boundary there would be an isogloss. Here's a classic example. What words do you use to address a group of two or more people? Do you say you guys? Well, you sound like a lot of people on the West Coast and throughout a big chunk of the country. Do you say you, right? Well, you might sound like some of the people, around kind of the New York area, maybe. If you say y'all, you sound maybe a little bit more like some of the people in the South, right? These are all great examples of isogloss. What is the generic term for a sweetened carbonated beverage? Again, the word I most often use is probably soda. But have you ever heard somebody from, big chunks of Michigan and the northern, kind of Midwest United States, it's common to hear them say pop. Throughout the South and Texas, it's common to hear people refer to all, here I want to say soda again, but all of those sweetened carbonated beverages as Coke, right? Whether it's Sprite or Dr. Pepper or whatever, you just say, I want to get a Coke or something, even if you actually mean some other specific drink, right? And then some strange people, I'm not sure where they at, might just say soft drink, right? But again, these are examples of isoglosses, and where we would kind of draw the boundary between one prominent usage and another is that isogloss, the boundary. I've even seen this done sometimes for curse words, darn being the most appropriate for the classroom here. But you can map out the usage of even curse words geographically and draw boundaries around where that is more common and where it's less common. This is a more official map of the dialects of English used in the United States. Within dialects, there are often subdialects, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. For example, English is spoken in Australia, Scotland, and Mississippi are all from different dialects. But within the United States, there are differences between someone from the South, Northeast, the West Coast. This map shows the distribution of some of the more prominent dialects or subdialects found in the English spoken in the USA. Notice that the distinction between dialects becomes less prominent as you move west compared to the more numerous dialects found along the more densely populated East Coast. So that is our lecture there on language taxonomy. All right. Remember that it would be a good idea to try and practice doing that with other languages and seeing how you can sort of classify them, right? And get into the habit of that. Remember that we would add to these maybe two more distinctions, right? Of a dialect and then even more specifically an accent if we wanted to be really precise about where a speaker was coming from. Finally, your book uses this image as a way to describe what we've been talking about. Often, language classification systems can be depicted as a kind of tree. The language family is something like the trunk of the tree. Language branches are the branches. The groups would then be smaller offshoots from those branches, and the individual leaves are the languages. And the size of the leaves in this case are showing the amount of speakers of a particular language. Notice, though, that if you follow the tree trunks down far enough, they converge into hypothesized superfamilies. This helps to show the idea that many linguists believe that if we could look far enough back in time, we would see that even the major language families of the last several thousand years themselves diverged from some even older language family. All right, that wraps up this intro lecture to language. Hopefully this has helped you connect some ideas and understand the content for this unit. Talk to you guys again soon. Have a good one.